Martin Roscoe, welcome to Beyond Stage Fright. You're arguably one of Britain's best-loved pianists with an international reputation as a soloist, recitalist and chamber musician. You've made numerous recordings, you've made more than 500 broadcasts for BBC Radio 3, and you're currently a professor of piano at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London. Now, with a career that spans more than four decades and all this experience, would you say that dealing with performance stress and performance nerves gets any easier?
Well, it's an interesting point. I don't think it does at all, really. The main thing for a pianist is that you are, or used to be anyway, expected to play most of your repertoire from memory. And that in itself creates a huge pressure. Now, for the best part of 40 years, I played most of my solo recitals and concerto performances from memory, and I don't do that anymore. I took the decision about 2 years ago. I'm not saying I'll never do it again, but that in itself has reduced performance anxiety, quite understandably so. But it hasn't eliminated it, interestingly. So, I think it's a useful discipline to be able to play from memory, and I think, in fact, it's very important for one to know the pieces from memory, whether you're actually going to play them from memory or not. I think that's also a slightly separate issue. But certainly, I think I talk about this a lot with my colleagues, and I've got some great colleagues in the business. We all talk about this issue of memory and the effect it has on us in terms of the level of performance anxiety. As far as I'm concerned now, the most important thing is to just try and concentrate on the music. And fortunately, I still absolutely love music, and I still want to play. I think the experience of my career has brought me to a point where I do feel able to say more in my playing. So to remove that extra level of anxiety is, for me, beneficial as far as the music's concerned. And interestingly, I also noticed that the vast majority of people don't care. They don't mind at all. And in fact, I would go even further and say that more people come to my recitals now than they did 5 or 10 years ago. But certainly, you might expect, I suppose, a non-performer might expect that as you get older, you get less anxiety. But I think, in general, looking around at my colleagues and my own experience, I'd say the reverse is true. Well, I know one who won't mind me mentioning her, and that's Catherine Stott, because she is very keen on this whole issue of memory or not memory, and she doesn't play from memory at all, and took the decision a long time ago, nearly 20 years ago, to stop doing that. She thought it was having a very adverse effect on her music making, having that extra level of anxiety due to the memory. But she's not the only one. It's worth mentioning, of course, that Liszt was the man who brought in playing from memory. Until he did it, nobody did. And also that the idea behind it, from his point of view, was to score points off his competitors, quite brazenly so. Look at what I can do. And, well, that's great. But, unfortunately, it was taken over as something that seemed to be demanded from the public. Liszt gave up playing recitals at the age of 38. So it's quite interesting to know. One would like to have him back on the planet to ask him why.
What are the other big stresses on you in your professional performing life?
Travelling is, I've chosen to live in the Lake District because it's such a wonderful place to live. So in that sense, I've already saddled myself with a lot of extra travelling around to engagements and indeed to teaching. And I'm fortunate that at 62 I'm still able to get around, but it is often quite daunting to get in the car and think that you've got to drive for 3 hours and then give a recital, and then sometimes drive home afterwards. And I still occasionally do that. I'm trying to stop doing it now, actually. Working with other musicians, the interpersonal relationships can be anxiety making. When I was younger, certainly I occasionally worked with a conductor who was a little bit either indifferent or slightly defensive in one way or another, and there were occasional moments made me quite anxious. But I think that was in the days when I was a sort of up and coming young soloist, and the conductors were a lot older than me. It's usually the other way around now. They're a lot younger than me. They usually want the benefit of my experience. Well, I mean, one can get anxious about the diary. I mean, if there are gaps in the diary, especially as the gaps get nearer and nearer. But I've been very fortunate in my career that I've always ended up being busy. And sometimes, and especially now in the last few years, what with the economic uncertainty maybe in the country, people are booking later and later. So I'm still getting quite a lot of dates coming in for October, November this year, which is good because at one point my diary was very thin there. So I try, after all this time, not to get anxious about that.
How do you keep your focus when you're on stage?
Having the music there is very good because you can, you've got that direct contact with the score, and then you're making the sound. So there's sort of something for the eyes to focus on, and I think that's important. I think it's important for me anyway to sort of have some quiet time before the performance. So I don't like to socialise very much. A friend of mine recently said I was playing the Ravel left-hand concerto in Manchester at the Bridgewater Hall for the very first time, that piece, and I was quite stressed by having to do it. I mean, it's a wonderful work, it's fiendishly difficult. And a friend of mine said, well, let's meet for a bite to eat before the performance, and I said, well, no, I don't think so. I think I need some quiet time on my own in the dressing room there before I go out, but let's meet afterwards and when I can relax. Actually, a colleague of mine, the wonderful Canadian clarinetist James Campbell, or Jim as everybody calls him, once made me really laugh in a pre-concert chat. He said the two best things about concerts are the phone call that offers you the date and afterwards. And to some extent that sort of sums up our life, That I mean, some of my friends get really frustrated actually that I find it difficult to say I've actually enjoyed a performance. I often enjoy them a lot more in retrospect, or if I'm listening to a recording of the concert, I can get a lot more enjoyment than I usually have at the time because I'm so sort of concerned about getting it right and communicating the music. Another little thing that I occasionally used to do, and I sometimes still do it, is that I have a very close friend who's a Tai Chi teacher, and he showed me a series of manoeuvres that I found very calming in the dressing room just before you go on to play. A few simple, slow, I mean, you could say, well, stretching exercises would have the same effect, but probably true. But I think that's quite useful. Other stresses can affect one's performance anxiety is an interesting field because I think most people know that a few years ago, it's 13, 14 years ago now, I had a very stressful situation with regard to a teaching position I was in, and I left that position rather publicly, and it was in the press, so on and so forth. And a few months later I started to get, quite out of the blue, panic attacks and anxiety, very high levels of anxiety, which I think were probably caused by the stress of that and the confrontation that I actually chose to go into in that situation. And but the impact that it had on me with what is a sort of depressive illness, really, I think now is recognised as such. Very fortunately, it only lasted about 2 years in total, but the worst bit was over within 6 months. And but I found that in performance, I was thinking incredibly negative thoughts about my health, and I had this sort of obsessive idea that I was going to actually collapse and die during a performance. Well, it doesn't really matter whether you do it then or any other time, does it? It's going to happen at some point. But why was it important that I shouldn't have that during a performance? And often it was the easiest. I say easiest pieces. The pieces I knew inside out, normally had absolutely no stress over, like the Schubert-Trout Quintet, a piece I've played well over 100 times. And I found myself getting really tied up in my head before I went on to play with these ideas. The one physical thing that did happen to me at that time was my blood pressure went up quite a lot, and I've had to handle that ever since. Really, fortunately, it's on an even keel now, but at the time it was very disturbing, and that also preyed on the. I think my stress levels as a performer went up a lot at that time. I also had. A form of anxiety attack is, claustrophobia. So I'd be playing a concert and I sort of wanted to run away. I wanted to run off the platform. I never did, but somehow or other, with the help of a very good, my local GP, who was fantastic, I managed to keep going. I only had to cancel one concert in all those months that was going on because of that stress. So I'm grateful for the right medical advice, because I think a lot of people just go away and shut themselves away. And I was told in no uncertain terms by my doctor that leads to depression. Anyway, those times are in the past, fortunately, and I suppose there's always a nagging feeling that they might return, but I think it's long enough now for me to know also that to have things that I can do to perhaps combat that if it happens again.
Did that, all of that stress, did that impact the quality of your music making, did you feel?
No, it didn't. That was an extraordinary thing, because I remember one of the worst things was a violin recital with Tasmin Little that I did, and I worked with Tasmin a lot over many years, and it was in the Chester Festival. It was in 2003, and a full house, and repertoire that I knew inside out, including the César Franck Sonata. And I was on the platform wanting to run off and feeling terrible, with this high anxiety. And my brain was able to sort of notice that actually my hands were going to the right place all the time, and that it wasn't affecting my playing at all. In fact, Tasmin said afterwards, I didn't tell her what was going on in my head until afterwards, and she said, "Oh, Martin, you're on tremendous form tonight." And of course, that is bound to help. I think, if you are feeling desperate, which I was on that occasion, and then you feel that the audience is still enjoying your playing, and you're not actually messing things up, then that is bound to be good.
But it also shows the power of preparation, the power of muscle memory, and knowing the pieces inside out, and the experience, doesn't it?
Well, all those things are obviously vitally important. If that recital had included a major new piece for me, then there might have been a different result. I acknowledge that.
So how did you move on from that whole really difficult experience?
Well, I'm not the only one of my colleagues, and I'm not going to mention any names here, but I'm not the only person who's had these things happen to them by any means. I know several others, actually. After a few months of feeling, of this high level of anxiety, and it wasn't only confined to performance either. I was teaching, I feel awful sort of getting on the train to go to London to teach. I didn't want to go at all, and I feel quite anxious about it sometimes. Knowing that it wasn't a physical illness was very important to me, and I had a wonderful acupuncturist here in Cumbria who, her partner at the time was a clinical psychologist, and she said, I want to mention it to him, what you're going through, if that's all right. And I said, of course, I need all the help I can get. And so I got a couple of CBT books on her recommendation, which I found incredibly helpful, because for the first time I could actually read what I was going through, recognise all the symptoms, and recognise that actually I wasn't physically ill. Apart from the high blood pressure, there was nothing the matter with me physically. And that I could go on from there and handle those issues. The anxiety I have now before concerts is normal, I think. Is what I would regard as normal, and back to where I was earlier in my career. Or, if anything, slightly less as a result of the decision not to play from memory.
What do you feel about this whole contentious issue of taking beta blockers or anxiety-reducing drugs?
I had a student who was he was at Leeds University, and he used to come to me privately at home, and he would be in a terrible state when he came for his lesson with nerves, and I didn't understand why one should feel. I mean, it's normal for students to be slightly anxious in piano lessons, I think, and I can sort of, so long ago now, I can remember just occasionally feeling a little bit anxious. But I had two wonderful teachers. They didn't make me feel anxious. I tried not to make my students feel anxious, of course. But this boy, he was in a terrible state, and it seriously affected his playing in the lessons. And he couldn't control his playing. And one day came, and he sat down and he played from memory the Chopin G minor ballade, and it was fantastic. I said, Sebastian, what's going on here? I'm on beta blockers, he announced. So I thought, well, I've got to give this a go. So I went to my then GP, not the same one I referred to earlier, and he was very sceptical about it, actually. He said, well, I'll tell you what then. He said, we'll give it a go. He said, I'm going to give you a very, very low dose. We sort of targeted one concert. He said, I want you to take one at tea time the day before the concert, one before you go to bed, and one in the morning, and then nothing. So I did that. But it slowed me down so much. And it removed the anxiety, but actually my memory was terrible in the concert. She said I didn't care. It felt like I didn't care. And I thought, this isn't going to work for me at all. It might be fine for some people. I don't have any objection to people, using those things at all. That's up to them. If it helps them, I don't see anything wrong with it at all. But it didn't work for me.
Talking about your students, how do you help your students deal with performance stress and nerves?
Well, I think it's important for them to know that I have them. And that, the stories about, I think everyone knows that Martha Argerich, for example, one of the very greatest of all pianists, suffers terribly with performance anxiety before she goes on. Sometimes she's almost got to be physically pushed on the platform. And, there are other examples from the past. I'd better be careful not to mention names but I think Martha has been very open about it. In fact, I think there's a documentary doing the rounds now, which I've seen part of on YouTube with her daughter. It's important for the students to know that, when they see me walk confidently onto the stage and smile and bow to the audience and sit down, I don't necessarily feel relaxed or confident or great inside. That's part of the presentation of the performance, because it's absolutely vital that the audience don't think you're nervous. If they see somebody come look rather sheepishly wander on and shaking, then they're going to feel uncertain and they won't be able to feel comfortable and enjoy the music. So that's part of the professionalism of the situation. And then, of course, we do talk about stress management and how to I underline to them particularly because they of course do have to play from memory, as I did when I was a student and for the first part of my career, and like everybody else they will have memory slips occasionally. There isn't a pianist on the planet that's never had a memory slip, so they have to learn how to manage their memory slips, and they also have to know that no matter how well you think you think you can play in the practice room when no one's listening, then as soon as you go to a lesson, or even more so a performance, then it's all different. Now, what I do at home, and I recommend it to them, is that when I'm preparing for a recital program, about 3 or 4 days beforehand, I find a date where I invite some people around to my house. I give them a glass of wine, a bite to eat, and then I play for them. And I think that is a fantastic preparation for the concert, really. And most of the pianists I know do this in one form or another.
How do you think we could help musicians generally with this whole issue, not just the performance nerves, but managing performance stress?
Well, acknowledging it is an important part of the process, I think, and sort of really knowing that that everybody has it, that it's normal, actually. And therefore, it's how you manage it that's important. And sorry to harp on the same, obviously preparation is still at the bottom, the most important thing, the preparation of the music, but also, as just described, the preparation to make yourself nervous in one way or another, so that you know that you can actually overcome it when you're actually on the platform and still focus on what you've got to do. But pretending it doesn't happen is the worst thing you can do. It's part of being human.
Would you say for you that the pressures come more from inside or outside?
Definitely inside. I think you know, life has pressures as well as wonderful things, and you know, you can't necessarily do something about the fact that you're travelling to a concert and you're sitting in a traffic jam for half an hour. You've got to leave early so that doesn't affect your journey time. I mean, Winston Churchill, not my favourite person maybe, but he said he suffered, as is well known, with serious depression periodically. And he came out once with, this was when he was Prime Minister during the war, and he said, well, I never worry about something unless I can do something about it. Logical thought can be very helpful in these situations. But yes, I think a lot of the uncertainty in one's head, I mean, that just comes, that's part of, again, it's natural, it's part of the process, and most of the pressures definitely will come from inside. How you handle them is the important thing.
So how do you handle them?
How do I handle them? By trying to be logical and thinking about it, you know, and thinking, well, you know, I'm going to, you know, I try to say to myself, well, look, you're playing the Schubert G major sonata tonight. I mentioned that because I just played it 2 days ago. What an amazing, wonderful work it is. How am I going to, you know, make the audience really, help the audience to really understand what a fabulous work it is, and communicate the beauty and the serenity of it. And I think putting those more positive thoughts in one's head, that's part of, I think, I might be speaking slightly as an amateur here, but isn't that what CBT is supposed to be about? Is to alter the way that you think, so that the positive thoughts are at the forefront and the negative ones are in the background. And I think that is a vital strategy that one can adopt. And and as I say, you know, just thinking, not just thinking about the piece in terms of, you know, an abstract or the structure of it and so on, but just hearing some of what you're going to play in your head while you're in your car journey or whatever. But there are other things one can do, and you know, you can divert your thoughts maybe as well if you're feeling anxious onto something completely amusical. You know, you can read the paper, or you can play solitaire on your iPad, or you can go for a walk. Actually, I often do that in the hour before. Not very far, just at a gentle pace, just around. Gets you out of the dressing room and the stress of that may be in there with you.
And you talked about the relief of it being over, but there must be another aspect to the actual performance itself. How do you feel when it goes really well on stage?
Yes, you can. Certainly, you know, frequently I can sort of sense how well it's going. I sense it particularly in recitals where there comes a point, particularly in quiet passages, where you sort of sense the concentration and of the audience and the fact that they're really listening to you, that they're hanging on to every note. It's a very powerful feeling, that, actually, you know, when that happens. And you know, I mean, I played, as I said, this wonderful Schubert sonata the other night. There were several times actually in that where. Especially in a long diminuendo, you know, you could sort of think, going quieter and quieter and quieter, you sort of sense the audience are with you. And that's very gratifying, I think, and it gives me great pleasure. Because, you know, they're really loving the music. Not that they're really loving me, I mean, you know, they're really into the piece of music I'm playing.
Martin Roscoe, thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Well, I've really enjoyed it too, Charlotte. Thank you for asking me.